Yeah, there's this one shot that stuck really hard in my head of Rochester walking across the windy plains, and he has like a bunch of ruffles on his jacket for some reason, and they all get like blown up. Like, okay, great. Like, okay.
Style points. It's all for style. It's like, okay, here's this jacket. It's going to keep you warm. He's like, no, I need 1,000 fluttering layers so I can be like dramatic when I arrive.
I want to see more brooding.
Good evening, Lillian. How are you?
I
didn't mean to sound like a Dracula.
I had a whole
good evening.
little bit in my head that I was going to do, but the way you said good evening, hilarious. The fact that we always tell our guests, our audience, when we're recording at night because it's such a different energy.
Exactly. I'm like, oh, I hope I can stay awake. I can. I'm very
They
excited
need to know
this.
right away there's a dork outside.
Yeah. But Lillian, it's not just us here cackling like we normally do. We have a guest in the studio with us today.
That's nuts.
Maybe he should introduce himself.
Oh, I should introduce myself?
Stranger who's on the call with us. Who are you?
I have to say who I am. I thought you guys were gonna list my bona fides.
Just your name,
etc.
Your credentials.
All right.
Listen, we told our audience last week, and I'm going to tell them again. This is a serious Nepo baby situation.
Oh, 100%.
We were also desperate to have somebody join us, and we're like, your brother would do it, wouldn't he?
He'd be willing. His standards are low enough.
Who do we know that knows nothing about Jane Eyre, that is easily bullied into doing what we want, and owns a good microphone? The list became one human person.
I am truly in the center of that Venn diagram.
What's your name, though, my guy?
My name is Patrick.
Oh my God.
Hi,
Patrick Cotter?
Welcome to the podcast.
Named by the same person as one of the people on this call.
Piper.
Yes.
My parents named Piper.
Have some shocking soap opera level reveals to make as my first.
This is actually news to Piper, is that your parents didn't name you.
What?
Lisa and Zip Cotter did.
So I said one person, exactly one person. So Lillian, Piper's parents named you.
It was just like it was a whole situation. It was very weird. We're not going to get into it because it'll take the whole show.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a crazy story. It's one of the reasons we're so close. But so going back to the Venn diagram of how you got the honor of being here today, Patrick, we wanted someone who hadn't, in the very least, hadn't watched a version of Jane Eyre all the way through. So what is your experience with Jane Eyre leading up to this moment?
Before Saturday, when I watched this film, my experience with Jane Eyre was mostly hearing my sister talk about her podcast.
Nice.
That was my main exposure. So I did know that his wife was crazy and locked in the attic.
Okay.
So that particular thing was not a surprise to me.
Darn.
Exactly. I know.
I was really hoping you might not know the spoilie, but I figured Lillian would have talked enough about the story.
It was published almost 200 years ago. There's been a lot of time for the spoilers to percolate, I think.
Still caught me by surprise when I first saw it. So it's like, what?
But some people might not have ever watched a movie of Jane Eyre. They may never have read it, and they thought to themselves, episode 87 of the Jane Eyre Airbuds podcast with guest Patrick Cotter, probably the best way to get into this. So
it's because of all my star power.
Yeah, which fair. But for those people, hello, welcome, what a choice. Really proud of you.
Maybe they just listen to this podcast and they've never consumed anything Jane Eyre. And so this is the first time that they're experiencing real relatability.
True.
Wow. Because they just come to listen to our voices, but every time we talk about plot details, they go la 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 la. Don't! I just want to hear you guys laughing for 5 hours.
Super cut of just our laughter.
Yeah. Well, no, just the podcast without spoilers for Jane Eyre.
There you go.
Podcast.
It's a short episode every time, and it is mostly you laughing.
Oh my gosh.
But we don't worry, listeners, as much as I like to make jokes about bullying my brother, I did ask him before he was on a recorded line if he would recap this. So
yes.
By the way, just because I know I almost just did it, I call him Petrie. No one else on earth does. You can do whatever you want because you're our listeners. And so I'm allowed to give you permission to do that. So just listeners of this very niche podcast will know Patrick as Petrie.
Yes.
But
that's an insider.
I am Petrie to my sister and fans of Air Buzz.
Put that on the back of your next business card, Patrick. Be like, what? It's like, don't worry about it. It's a joke for 5 people.
Hey, we got more than 5. Thank you, listeners.
It's true. But Patrick, it's time for you to tell us the story of Jane Eyre as fast as you can.
As fast as I can. All right, tell me when to start.
I've got this timer up. I'll start it once you start talking.
Okay. So there's a little girl. Her name is Jane Eyre. She is living in a big house. And she gets, she goes. Her aunt sucks. And her aunt says, "I'm sending you to school," and she's like, "Yay, school!" And then it's a terrible school. And there's a doctor, and he's nice, and he shows up, and he says, "Oh, these kids, they're gonna get sick because of the cold." And then they get punished, and they get sick because of the cold, and her like best friend dies, and then she's old now, and by that I mean she's like 20, and now they offer her a job, and she says no because I'm going to be a governess, and then she goes and becomes a governess. And there's a man, and it's Orson Welles, and you can't see anything other than Orson Welles. And there's also a child that she's taking care of. He's
the child.
And there's a man, and it's Orson Welles, and he says, and he just immediately bears his heart to her. And then they decide they're in love, and then another woman shows up, and she's jealous of her. But Rochester doesn't actually like her. And then he says, "Marry me," and she says yes. And then they're getting married, and a man comes in and says, "You can't get married. You're already married." And then they go upstairs, and there's also a fire. But that was earlier. And then they go upstairs, and they open a door, and they're screaming, which is, I think that was it's just like as soon as they opened the door, there was screaming, and then you don't actually see what's on the other side of the door, but the implication is that it's his wife. And then he's like, "I'm so sorry, and I am married, and it was when I was 19." And then she's like, "No, but I still have to leave." And then she left, and then she went to her childhood home, and her aunt is sick, and Bessie is there. Bessie was the one servant that was nice to her, and then her aunt dies. And then she gets a bunch of money from her aunt, kind of implied, I think. There's an auction, and kind of implied. And then she hears Rochester saying her name, like, over the plains. And she goes to his house, and his house burnt down, and his wife killed herself. And now they can get married because he's blind. And she's rich, and he's not, ?
You did it!
Yay.
So for our listeners, there's a small chance that Piper might cut out some of the like pauses or thinking moments. But I just need all of you to know that if you didn't know who was related to Patrick before he started the summary, you do now, because he pulled a Lillian, and that was super long. That was 2 minutes and 50 seconds.
All right.
When it comes to the timing things, I never edit those because we need the legitimacy. So everyone's going to get that full 2 minutes. Yeah. No, I think my favorite part is that at the end, she's allowed to marry him now because he's blind, because his eyesight is what was keeping them apart.
A little bit it was, I feel like. The fact that Rochester could see was part of what was keeping them apart.
Yeah, there you go. Problem solved. Now he's ready.
I have been dying to ask you this question.
Okay.
Since I heard that you'd watched the movie a few days ago.
Yes.
What did you think?
I thought it was all right. It just felt very of its era. I don't know. What like in what way?
You killed it.
Very like, all right. I guess my first kind of like, to set the stage here, Patrick, are you someone who enjoys kind of like old movies from that time, or are you someone who are like, I'll suffer through it if I have to?
I'm more in that category. I'm not like a big Citizen Kane guy. I watched Citizen Kane and fell asleep, and I'm like, I can probably understand that this has like, you know, historical value, and if you compare it to movies of the era, it's probably really good. But like, it's awesome. we stole all the good bits and put it in movies already, so it's not like impressive anymore.
Yeah.
There you go. So glad that we set you up for forcing you to watch like a spooky old romance, and one from a time period that you're not crazy about. So what a good player you are.
But but on the other hand, I am a big fan of like Gothic literature.
Okay.
So like,
sweet.
So this is actually my other exposure to Jane Eyre, which was when Lillian was talking about her podcast, and I said something wrong about Jane Eyre, and you were like, yeah, so you really don't know anything about Jane Eyre. And I was like, maybe if it was Gothic literature, I would know something, because I've taken a class in Gothic literature.
It's like, surprise.
Well, good news.
I got a twist for you. Well, and I will say, this is by far, we talked about, I think it was our last episode. No, the one before this was on the Gothic elements of Jane Eyre.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things where it's like, you don't know if it's because you just talked about that or if it would have struck you anyway. But this is one of the most Gothic adaptations, if not the most.
And we talked about that in the last episode too. I remember asking you like what you thought the ones were, and definitely this is 43, right?
Yep.
I think the visuals that stand out to me the most of like making this like the iconic like Gothic adaptation is when she arrives at the castle, which here it is literally like a spooky castle. Like that is like one of the coolest shots in the whole movie, in my opinion. The kind of like shadow plane, shadow box kind of thing of her getting off the carriage and going into the horrifying house, and then also just what the countryside looks like when she almost gets run down.
Well, yeah, there's this one shot that stuck really hard in my head of Rochester walking across the windy plains, and he has like a bunch of ruffles on his jacket for some reason, and they all get like blown up. Like, okay, great. Like, okay.
Style points. It's all for style. It's like, okay, here's this jacket. It's going to keep you warm. He's like, no, I need 1,000 fluttering layers so I can be like dramatic when I arrive.
I want to see more brooding.
There are two big things that I have learned since watching this. So learned way more about the movie. But I also, so we watched this was one of the first 10 that we watched. So it's been like a year and a half since we watched this last. So I've learned a lot about that. We read the book, but I also learned a lot about Orson Welles.
Yeah.
This man,
weird guy,
was obsessed with Jane Eyre. He recorded like 6 or 7 radio versions of it for his radio program, both before and after this movie.
Cool.
He like, in reading about this film, it was like peak Orson Welles celebrity, peak Orson Welles like star power. So they let him do whatever he wanted. He directed this movie. This is Orson Welles' Jane Eyre. And every shot like that made me laugh, because that is what that man wanted that shot to look like.
Yeah.
Well, that's awesome.
And there's a lot where you go, it's genuinely beautiful. Like, you're like, oh man, look at that cool light go through there, and look at that, you know, like, And it is, someone had a vision here.
When a fan of the original story is working on it, and then also someone who is this auteur of cinematography and everything, that's a pretty incredible combo. And I shared this with Lillian, but apparently Guillermo del Toro believes that Orson Welles is the absolute perfect rendition of Rochester. So
it's funny.
Many talented people agree.
I actually, it's funny because to me, this comes in the first scene. My identification was, one, all I see is Orson Welles. And two, because all I see is Orson Welles, I see Orson Welles trying to do the like booming voice intimidating guy. and so I'm just like, he puts on some fuzzy eyebrows. He puts on some like some just caked on makeup. And then he does the deepest voice he can muster.
It's such a deep voice. Like that's like what was taking most of my concentration away too, is every time he would speak, I'm like, it doesn't seem like that voice should be coming out of this man.
That, and there are scenes that, again, like, so we've talked about before that, like, usually when I'm watching these, I'm taking a lot of notes, but when we do the rewatches, I just try to watch the movie and see what sticks with me. And this one, I did not notice this at all the first time we watched it. This time I could not notice it. Especially in the fireplace scenes, there's a lot of scenes where he's like barely moving his mouth. And it is super clear to me that the audio is dubbed over that.
Oh, yeah. A lot of
yes,
ADR.
100%. Yeah. I noticed the same thing, too, with like the delivery of like Miss Fairfax and stuff like that. It wouldn't surprise me if like the entire movie was like voiced after the fact.
There were,
just to get a quality that they
wanted.
There
were moments I could tell. Like there was one of those fireplace scenes I could tell like it transitioned. You could kind of hear the transition of that was recorded in scene, and then okay, that's ADR. You know?
Yeah. Totally.
So because I could see,
I think
he could make. He did it on the radio, right? So he has some. Yeah. He has some very specific. I want it to sound this way, and I'm sure that he had some. Absolutely. If it didn't come out right, he's got to re-record it. Not boomy enough. More boomy.
What are some of your thoughts about I think it's Joan Fontaine, right? She's our Jane. What about this actress, either performance or whatever?
Or what do you think about Jane?
To you?
Yeah. Well, okay. So, I mean, I think so. I have also afterwards, I think, and that's the important thing. I did read the Spark Notes for Jane Eyre, and I think like it is. Jane Eyre is like a classic. To me, it comes off as like a classic, like almost Christ-like figure, right? Like very like there's like, I think one of the big things it highlights, which I feel like a lot of novels of the era do is like how different the religious figures and the like actual people living the Christian values are, right? Like, because Jane Eyre is a great example of someone who, you know, believes in charity and caring for the lowest in society and all this kind of stuff. And then the loudest, most Christian people are also bastards, right? And so that's kind of like the character of Jane Eyre comes off as a self-insert a little bit, especially because, again, I've looked up some stuff about Charlotte Bronte. But
yep. I think so too, personally.
Truly to the point where when we talk about Charlotte Bronte, we often will say Jane. Sorry, Charlotte.
Yeah. Well, and then the other context of like she had a relationship with a married man, and then you go, so she wrote a self-insert novel where the person she was obsessed with, the wife died and he went blind, and so that they could be together.
Yes.
And that's the story.
No, it literally is. Like every time we watch like a documentary, or like we just saw this one called To Walk Invisible, which like is kind of like a biopic about their lives. And I can't now that I have that info, I'm like, this is still an incredibly powerful story, but it's also kind of like, it's like, well, I sat down that night and I wrote a seething story where like she was awful and crazy and he was obsessed with me, but I was too good for him. I said no. And so until she was dead, and then we got to be together, and it was perfect and great. And I'm just like, Jesus, Charlotte.
Yeah.
If that's how you handle your emotions, I mean, great. It created an amazing piece of literature, but
well, and like
what you know.
I was thinking about that so hard during the proposal scene this time, because I was like, you're leaving, which she did leave Belgium at one point. And I'm just imagining her having the conversation with him and him not saying any of that stuff and like not wanting to be like, oh, you're going to miss it here, aren't you? And she's just like, yes, I'm going to miss the school and learning and you.
And he's just like, well, bye. I can't thank you enough for all the time. Get out. Oh my gosh. Okay, so Adele.
Yeah, what do you think of
Adorable, annoying, great, bad?
I wasn't sure. The note I took was I'm not sure how serious that French accent's supposed to be. And then the other thing that struck me was just the comparison between her and the friend who died, and like that, and then that relationship with like, oh, Rochester isn't like the nicest, but he like does the material taking care of her, and so that kind of like why we would fall in love with this guy is like he's doing exactly the thing you wish you had and you wish the people around you had when you were a kid, that kind of stuff.
That's so interesting. I've thought about the parallels between Adele and Helen, but I've never thought about it from that perspective of like, Brocklehurst is the actual name, but I hate him, so he's Broccoli. Yeah. Broccoli like actively doesn't take care of these children, but claims to and brags about it all the time, where Rochester is taking care of Adele and yet is constantly talking about how he's not really doing that.
In fact, Broccoli is so actively not taking care of them that when the doctor closes the window so that they won't get a cold, once the doctor leaves, he flings the windows open and he's like, no! It's like, you will get a cold because it's going to be good for your soul.
The melodrama of this adaptation is so intense.
I'm like a big fan. I love the over-the-topness. I think that's how you got to do Gothic literature. I think people think of it as like, you know, oh, it's like so deep and so careful and so measured. And you're like, no, they're just, everything is turned up to 11. It's all about that melodrama and that silliness and that everyone is this ridiculous over the top character. And just constantly existing there, right? Like,
yes,
just always at a 10.
How long can you hold that high note?
Yeah, exactly. Nobody feels anything in a one. Everything is wham.
Well, and I think something that I've always thought about before and is the idea, like, I've always been like, wow, they were like so dramatic. They for sure knew it was funny. Like, Charlotte Bronte knew it was funny to be over dramatic, and this movie had a self-awareness. This movie is so much funnier than I remember it being. And I think part of it is I'm laughing at the jokes they're trying to tell. Like the moments when it's way over the top, they're trying to make me laugh.
No, it's so good. The only person in this film who I would say does not apply to that rule is Miss Fairfax, who is like a monotone, really doesn't show any facial expression. When she's like first leading Jane's through the hallways, like, it stood out to me that she's just kind of like, it looks almost like she's like reading off a piece of paper. She's like, well, it's really cold here and I don't know how to describe him, but he's kind of boring. Anyway, this is your house, miss. Bye. And I'm like, what is this? What's going on with this lady? But maybe that was supposed to like make you feel on edge when she's at the scary dark castle. And this lady is kind of like that. I don't know.
It is interesting. I actually, something that I would have loved to look up is which of the actors are British. Because
I'd say none of them.
They're doing mid-Atlantic accents, right?
Exactly. They're not doing British accents, which is funny. And and it's just like, I don't know. Some of this I do feel like, because it's an American interpretation, it's a little bit of a British caricature too.
Oh
like there's fun stuff.
Bessie like is a caricature for sure.
Yes, Bessie seems like a caricature. The fact that it is a castle, right? They're like, British people. What do British people do? They live in castles. Like,
live in castles. Yeah, we had a dragon, but we decided to cut it.
If you saw the house that Thornfield was supposed to be based off of, which we have shown before, it's like a little house with stone walls. Like, it's like, it's a big house for the time, and like it would be fancy, and it would be fancy to Jane. But relative to the massive castle in this movie.
Yeah.
No, so great.
That is good.
So we've covered little Adele, which, by the way, so she is, I can't think of her actress's name off the top of my head.
Tootie is all I can think of too.
I know the thing that she's like most famous from in my brain is that she plays one of the youngest sisters in the movie Meet Me in St. Louis. And so that's a movie that was, I think, shortly after this. Yep. So it's very funny to go from like that very clear American accent that we see her with there to then her doing her best like French accent. But also one thing that I kind of love about the performance too is I feel like she's very much trying to like talk like how she thinks like a grown lady talks. Mm-hmm. And I think that comes through in the performance. And I'm like, this is really cute.
This is one of the best Adele's. I think she captures the energy too of like, she's just so unbelievably cute. And they highlight, it is one of those situations where like they've got a really good Adele actress. Cause some of the Adeles that we've seen are props. Like they're just kind of also there. This is
one
far from
physically a puppet.
This is far from the worst French accent we've seen a child do.
That's incredible. I need to see some of these terrible French accents.
We've got some TV movies for you, my guy. But
do you know that Adele was cute enough in this that she was the only one where after the bed is set on fire that they're like, oh wait, the child, we should check on her. No other movie does that.
Yeah, is that in the book? Do you know? That's so funny.
In the book they don't give a fig.
In the book
like,
they
who cares?
never care about Adele.
That's
they remember
so
her
funny.
at the very end and send her to a good school.
Also, the thing I want to point out is, Jane kind of forgot about Adele. But Rochester really forgot about it. He said, Jane, wait right here. I'll fix this. And then left and did nothing for Adele.
Nope. He's taking care of the maniac upstairs. One problem at a time.
Also, speaking of that scene, I was very impressed by that fire effect. Yeah. I was like,
right?
That looks like real fire.
I think in a lot of the movies that we've watched of that time, they just lit the set on fire.
Yeah. They probably had somebody in the wings, but the actors took care of it, so they're all good.
Pre-OSHA.
Yeah.
There's a couple of things that stuck out to me in this, and I think the fire scene is for sure one of them. So when we were talking about our Gothic episode, I decided that they do have the stereotype of damsel in distress. It's just that Rochester's the damsel. Because both in the fall off the horse scene and the fire scene in the book, Rochester does none of the rescuing. He is in imminent peril. Jane puts the fire out by herself while he's passed out in the bed. And in the meeting on the horse scene, he's supposed to hurt himself badly enough that she has to essentially carry him to his horse. Like he like puts his arm around her and she helps him get on the horse. And in this one, Orson Welles was like, I don't think that Rochester's really a damsel.
Yeah. He's definitely.
He's like, no, I'm really masculine.
Well, that goes to Rochester in general. Okay, so this is one of the big things I wanted to talk about.
Okay.
I feel like Rochester is, in the book, probably Rochester is very ambiguous as to whether he's, your reaction for Jane should be, oh honey, get out of there, or you can fix him, right? And I feel like it's probably ambiguous at the end to be whether how happy you should be for Jane, other than I guess at the end it says we were happily married for like 10 years. But like, I would say in this, it's definitely ambiguous. Like, I don't think you get to the end and you're like, or at least I didn't get to the end and I was like, this is going to be great for her. Right? Like, this is going to work out.
I love hearing that perspective.
I feel like it's the more you sit with Jane Eyre, there are definitely different adaptations where I feel that way. For example, Ciarán Hinds, honey, no.
Oh God.
You are going to be unhappy with that man. It's going to be a rough situation. But you have stumbled into one of the most intense things that people who love Jane Eyre feel. They are adamant that Jane is supposed to be happy. And it is one of the most contentious things about adaptations as well, because there is a lot of room for interpretation in the book as to what Rochester is saying and doing. So there's a lot of one of the things I was struck by was how many of the lines, now that I know the book this well, are directly from the book. But there's not a lot of description of his body language or his tone or any of those things. So those are all up for interpretation. And Orson Welles decided he was a real man.
Yeah, he was.
Yeah, he's manly and mysterious and full of passion.
Yeah.
So I feel like the answer to this is maybe like super obvious, but just to spell it out for us, what were the red flags for you, Patrick, about why maybe she shouldn't be happy with him in the end?
Why don't you think?
Why isn't it a happily ever after?
This is not the kind of man you want women to be with.
Well, I would say maybe the biggest one is the locking his wife in the attic.
Okay.
And here's the thing.
What is the problem there? She's crazy.
Well, exactly. So the book directly addresses, or the movie rather. I don't know about the book, but the movie directly addresses this. And he's like, I'm giving her every humane whatever, right? Like, and you do the math, and you're like, okay, an insane asylum in 1847 is not really a place you'd want to be. You'd rather be in locked in the attic of your husband's house. But in this story, Bertha is not given a lot of character other than spooky, right? She's literally an off-screen horror, right? They're like, we can't even show you; she's so scary.
Yeah, right? You wouldn't believe it if you saw.
I want to come back to your red flags, but I want to do a quick little Bertha tangent.
Yeah.
So what did you think of them not showing Bertha? Like,
I don't know. I think it really depends. So, I mean, so there's the actual interactions with Bertha I kind of rolled my eyes at in this movie. But it almost comes down to like, what were they missing, right? Like what was the character of Bertha in the story? I think Bertha was very much a plot element rather than a character, right? Or like it was, and her being off screen entirely just kind of enforced that. There's stuff like the first time she opens the door when she goes upstairs, there's this scream cue exactly as she opens the door, and it just felt so jump scary and silly that like I had a hard time, like, and I feel like that's almost one of those jokes that like they're on, right? Like, and it's just, and so I feel like that's the limit of what they did for Bertha, and I don't know if that's what she was in the book, but it didn't. I mean, like the thing I got when I watched it is I thought of all the other Gothic horror that I've read, or Gothic literature in general that I read, and you know, I thought of like how Poe would describe Bertha, or how right, and it's like the idea of like all I could imagine was a 5-page long thing about the creeping horror of the something in the house that's mysterious and gonna get you, and how this horror reflects the horror of my relationship and the secrets of the right, and all those kind of stuff that I actually really like about Gothic literature. That's fun, and I feel like they didn't do that, and partly it's because I feel like that like, I don't know, that Gothic internal monologue is hard to create in film, and so instead they just had it be spooky.
Yeah.
Totally. One thing that we talked about a lot on our first watch through of this is that a lot of movies will decide that, you know, the goal of the film is not to make you think hard about the morals of the story, but to make you swoon over the main couple. And so their decision to not even show Bertha's face, like at most we see her from the back, at least it's implied that it's Bertha when she's looking out over like the field. But it kind of, our hypothesis is that by doing this, it kind of dehumanizes her. So it's not so much this other person you have to worry about. It's just the creepy monster that's the roadblock to you getting your blind guy that you're thirsty for.
Which I agree with all of those things. I think that they did a really good job at making this creepiness and making it fit within the story and all that stuff. But a fact that I have learned since the first time that we watched this is, at the time, and this came out both in the US but was very big in the UK as well. It actually came out in the UK prior to coming out in the US because it came out around Christmas time then there. This movie was illegal in the UK to show any form of madness on screen. So she was considered mad, and therefore they couldn't put her on screen and depict her insanity, because they thought it would make people insane.
Oh my God, it's contagious.
Yeah.
It's contagious through a scream.
Yep.
That's so funny. Okay, I didn't know that. I'm more familiar with like American Hays Code sort of like regulations, not the stuff that the UK did. So it's very interesting.
To be totally fair to you with what I'm about to say, we have talked about Jane Eyre like a lot and talked about a lot of fun facts. I have told you this before and you did react the exact same way. Yes.
Me?
On the podcast.
Oh. Well, I have a brain like a sieve, so
we both talked right before this about how exhausted we are, so fair.
Whatever. It's just reliving the content, man. It's coming back. Okay, the gothic elements, the main couple, the child. Trying to think here. So how about
a quick additional Bertha note for Patrick.
Yeah.
The way they interpret her, what you were saying about like her almost being a plot element versus a character, also is somewhat true in the book.
Sure.
And one of the things that is like a big complex thing to talk about is our understanding of Bertha comes almost wholly from Rochester. So whether or not she's crazy is a really big debate about Jane Eyre.
and that I think is like the red flag thing. Like that's exactly, I think it's one of those classic things where it's like, would that have even been as nearly as much of a red flag in 1848, right? Because that's one of the, or 1847, which
that's
is
so
one of the.
For you.
Sorry, I did actually. Okay, so this is my very nerdy note. Is that I think this is essentially a Depression era book. I don't know. So the 1840s were called the Hungry 40s. So 1845 was the first year of the potato famine, and it was also historically low yields for other crops in that year all across Europe. And 1848 was the year when a bunch of revolutions happened because people were starving, right? And so when you talk about, when Jane is out on the street super poor or whatever, right? Like that is a very real reality of like seeing very poor people all the time, right? And the idea, and so that's one of the contexts that I thought about, and the fact that again, even just reading the Spark Notes, I feel like this version was stripped of any class discussion.
Yeah. Oh, for
was like,
oh yes,
it was like we don't want to even slightly hint that we could be communist.
So one of the things I was going to kind of ask about is like your thoughts about kind of the story after Jane leaves the house, because that is like the biggest departure in this adaptation. The things you were just talking about, which I assume you got from the Spark Notes, of her kind of being penniless and wandering around and looking for help. And that's definitely the social commentary that Bronte was writing. This one was like, nah, what if she actually fell back on her resources and like went to the house and the people that she knows and got some place to live? Let's just go with that.
Yeah. That was actually, one of the other things I thought was so this is just very relevant to the like money discussion. So one of the things Rochester says is like, oh, they're doting on me for my purse, right? Like one of the reasons he doesn't like all of those other fancy people that aren't like Jane, is because they just want to take his money. And then there's in the back of my head, I was like, would Jane be into Rochester if he was like poor? And that's an interesting question. But then I think the answer to that,
we're just gonna kind of brush past. Oh, you're answering it. Okay.
But I think part of the answer to that is probably not. But Jane wouldn't like him if he was rich and an asshole, because here's the deal, right? Because he kind of is an asshole to these other people. I was
gonna say
he is,
and they still want to hang around, right? But she knows she grew up in a house that had money, but also was full of assholes. And so she knows that she would rather, right? I think in the back of her head, she's probably like, I would rather be penniless, but with somebody that I can trust than wealthy.
Which is very close to a line from the book.
Yeah, because at the end of the story, like in the original novel, she does inherit a small fortune from an uncle that passes away. So she is like taken care of and has her independence that way. So when she returns to her now poor blind asshole, she's like, well, at least I have money, so I can deal with you being a jerk. But in this one, you could almost ask that question. I liked how you, in your summary, you kind of said, and now he's poor, question mark, maybe? Like standing in the ruins of his house.
Well, yeah, I don't know. I don't know where his wealth exists. It might all be in his house, but you never know.
He has tenants who like pay him
so that
to like work the land and stuff like that.
$8,000 a year or £8,000 a year income, which was a significant sum.
Yeah, that's an insane.
It is from his tenants. So he is Patrick's favorite kind of person, a landlord.
He's a landlord. Yeah, but everyone who was rich back in the day was a landlord. The only way to make any money was to own land and have people pay you.
But he's he is, to be fair, a terrible landlord because he's literally gone all the time.
Yeah.
So like when he comes back, he's very annoyed by all the meetings he has to have because his tenants keep showing up because they have no idea how long he's going to be there.
Yeah, because Miss Fairfax is like, well, I'm accustomed to this man coming and going whenever he pleases. But yeah, it must suck for the tenant farmers who are like, hey, dude, my cows are dying. I need some help out here.
The fence broke a year ago and you were in France. Someone needs to fix the fence.
Yeah.
Seriously. Get on that, dude.
But
put a hammer and nail in Adele's hands. She'll have some fun
Adele
with that.
would be a great landlord as a child. Child Adele would be super good at it.
Seriously. She's like, well, I couldn't fix the fence, but do you want to watch me dance? And they're all like, yeah, go down. Sure. That'll be fine for a while.
That was another line that like those conversations, the fireside scenes and other things, like it did strike me so much in rewatching this. How many of those lines are from the book? Like the line where he says to Adele, which always sounds so harsh, this is how your mother charmed my English, or your French mother or something like dancing charmed the English gold out of my British pocket. I have no idea. But
although in this version he said britches, and I was like, weird.
They did randomly throw in lines that they thought felt British.
Yeah.
For sure. But okay, any other like big things that really stand out to you, Patrick, that you're like, hey, look, I know you guys have spent a year and a half of your lives talking about this, but here's something you've never considered.
I am fully annoyed that you've already gotten a couple that we've never. I'm so annoyed that you've already gotten some that we haven't talked about.
This is why we need the outside opinions.
No, we don't. Send them away.
Her cousin, the little boy, I think was the best casting in the world.
So good.
This evil little doughboy.
My quote was, why does it look like I feel like his mouth is always full of candy, and why do I feel like I can smell him and he smells like syrup?
He's one of the children from Willy Wonka's Chocolate Factory. He's like Augustus
He's truly the most like John Reed is a deeply hateable character. He's awful, but he's kind of like viciously awful.
Yeah.
Where this child is like so soft. And he's just like a little cherub who like eats too much, and his mom is trying to keep him small all the time, which is why his clothes are so tight. And he's just got the little blonde ringlets, and he sits next to his mom being like, I've never done nothing wrong in my whole life.
I liked that he and Jane had like a little like scrap like right in front of all the adults, and it's just like, look at what he's doing, and they're like, no, it's her, she's awful and sinful.
Well, and like that was something that really struck me in this rewatch was the way they introduced Jane, which I know we talked about previously. So there's a whole scene with the red room and all sorts of stuff that they cut out from the childhood because they're trying to get through it fast. But the way they introduced Jane in this, they go up to the door. And I didn't notice the first time we watched this, how similar all the shots of that door are to the door that Bertha is behind. Because one of the big conversations about the book is Bertha meant to be a person, or is she essentially an extension of Jane and this existence of like Jane's internal animalistic nature and like a metaphor and all that stuff. And I think the parallel that is so clearly intentional, because when you watch this movie, like the cinematography is really intentional, the lighting is really intentional, the music is really intentional, like all of it was clearly curated with a lot of thought. So the way they go up to the door, and the fact that that servant says to Bessie, be careful, she like could get you, like that feels like that feels like they're describing going up to Bertha's door, and then to have that open and instead it's this little girl. it does make you think about what are they saying about Bertha with that?
Yeah.
Which is really interesting to me.
I like that parallel. What stood out to me on this one is when Jane is brought up to take care of Mr. Mason, and just the way that the door behind her with the big bolt in front of it is so ominously lit that it's just looming over her shoulder. So I like these comparisons. It's very cool.
Also, just so you know, Patrick, you may be thinking, having watched that scene, that some of the lines do you faint at the sight of blood, or don't say anything to her, you can't talk to him if he wakes up, that feels over the top. And the reason for that is because it is straight from the book.
That scene felt like it was straight from the book. That scene, I was like, this is what didn't feel like it was straight out of the book was the wedding scene, which is weird because it probably was, but there was something about that wedding scene that just felt so weird. It made the world feel so small. And it was like they were shooting this movie during World War II and they didn't have a lot of resources to fill a room full of people.
Weird. Well, no, they never have guests at their wedding. They're always, maybe you'll see Fairfax and Adele sitting in the background, but it's always just Rochester and Jane and the guy marrying them alone in the church.
And usually what you didn't get, but usually what they also have is Rochester basically dragging her into that church.
Oof.
Mm-hmm. Because he's anxious to get it over with so they can quickly flee the country because now they're going to be criminals.
And actually, did they even say they were going to go to France?
I don't know if it was
or
France,
but
the idea was they were going to travel, because you see
they have the whole line where he says to Adele that he's going to take her to the moon, which is in the book.
Yeah.
But
and they have the cute shopping spree, which there was a detail in this that I didn't pick up on before. During the shopping spree, there's a shot where Rochester and Jane are sitting in a carriage, and there's a fortune teller lady there, and he's like, "No, mother, we can tell our own fortunes. It's full of positivity and goodness." And he gives her a coin, and it's "Get away from me." And it's "Oh, you should have listened to what she had to say." Probably wedding will not happen, fire in your future, blind.
Tragically, we didn't make Patrick watch one of the most iconic Jane Eyre scenes. We should have found a different adaptation to watch so Patrick could see the scene where Rochester, so how classically when you're in love with someone, but they're your employee, so you don't want to straight up ask them "Hey, do you like me?" So instead, when you have a bunch of party guests over, you leave to run an errand, and then a fortune teller, which you use a different slur instead.
Yep.
A fortune teller shows up and says, "Hey, we have to read all the young ladies' fortunes," and then you read all of your guests, all of the single women, you read all of their fortunes. And then finally you trick them into bringing the governess in, and you kind of just ask her a lot of questions about whether or not she likes her boss. And then you reveal that it was you in drag the whole time.
Yes. And it's very important that when you do the reveal, you have to shout, "Off ye lendings."
That's a critical
That's a big power move. Only
that's
cool guys
a normal way to find out if someone likes you.
That is wild. I feel like I remember you mentioning this, and there's a lot of scenes in even truly great classic literature where just what are you doing? What are you talking about?
Here's a fact that I think you would enjoy, that I do think it's important that you read this other book that I'm going to make you read Jane Eyre now.
Yeah.
But another book that I think you would really enjoy that I haven't read and probably won't read because I don't think I'll enjoy it is Wuthering Heights. Because Jane Eyre is tame relative to Wuthering Heights.
I believe it.
Yeah. We've learned that story is even more buck wild, which we didn't think was possible.
And there's so many things in it. And so I would like your uncut thoughts about Wuthering Heights at some point.
Sure. So, and then, one of the other notes I made is when she gets sent to the school, it was modern troubled teens, some modern troubled teens places. Some of those messed up. Also probably about as Christian.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The hypocrisy of Christianity is a big theme in this. And not to plug our podcast to you on our podcast, but we had a professor come on a few months ago and talk to us about the theology of Jane Eyre. Sure. And I learned so much during that. And it's really interesting that you brought up the idea that a lot of literature at the time was critical of religion in this way, because I think a lot of the literature from the time that has lived on survived was critical of religion in that way, because religion, there are specific parallels of stories that were told similarly to Jane Eyre, familiar moments like Helen, who was her friend when they were a child, and other things that are explicitly Jane Eyre is going against those tropes, which is interesting because there are so many things now that we're so familiar with this story that are tropes because of Jane Eyre.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of things that felt really tropey about Jane Eyre that you learn it's because this is the origin of that, which is interesting.
Yeah.
For sure.
This was the first book ever to criticize religion.
Yep. No one's ever done it. I mean, it definitely not, again,
she's so brave.
Learning about the French Revolution and about how they would, they found that the guillotine was too slow for killing priests. So they tied up all the priests on a boat, pushed it out into the ocean, and then sunk it.
That's
much
not
faster.
A fact
Just get them all with one.
Usually, again,
Incredible.
You can tell who he's related to because he's bringing the really upsetting, true historical fun facts or not so fun facts.
I'm currently been going back to the show Poldark, which I'm sure many of our listeners are a fan of because it's a very good period drama, but also has a very hot, studly lead actor in it. But the conflict that they're talking about, the sort of the second season, is a lot of like civil unrest, and all the English people are so afraid because of what they're hearing about what's going on in France. And there's even a line in a recent episode where they're like, they've invented this awful machine. It's just like, everyone's super scared about it. So like, we have to keep people calm so they don't attack us.
The ironic thing about guillotines is that they're actually a much more humane way of killing people than the previous thing, which was hanging or like drawing and quartering, which is like horrible. And it's actually probably more humane than the way we kill people now. Lethal injection is bad, actually.
Patrick, we're supposed to bring historical sad facts, not current modern sad facts.
Sorry, ignore the troubled teens comment
Don't
as well.
Make me sad about what's happening right now.
Let's pretend that's not happening now, too.
I will say a criticism that I had, just because since we're talking about Lowood, a criticism that I had that I know we talked a lot about in our first episode of this, so I'm not going to go too in depth out of it, but also really stood out to me in this rewatch is you can tell this was made by men because they give a lot of the agency to male characters that in the book is female characters. For example, the doctor is sort of an amalgamation of a few different characters. But the main one that he's sort of taking the plot points of is a character called Miss Temple, who was a teacher there. And she had this very specific example of feminine strength that I love very much. And it makes me so angry that they gave all of her agency to a man.
The first comment I made was that the intro reminded me of Young Frankenstein. But the second comment I made was, yes, 3 men wrote the screenplay. That's encouraging.
I will say, unlike some of the other versions that we have watched, I'm fairly confident these men read the book. We've watched a lot of versions of this where I'm pretty sure they never read the book.
This one had some care. As we've established, Orson Welles is a stan.
Yeah.
He loves Jane.
Yeah, it did. Yeah. It genuinely did. There was a lot of stuff that it felt like this was not like a cynical there is sometimes a tendency to, when you're doing an interpretation, like judge the thing you're making. Or like, for example, like those campy jokes, like you can make it like rolling your eyes at literature from the 1800s. Whereas I do feel like, when they did that, it was like, I don't know. It felt like it was in on the joke with the novel.
All of the jokes were laughing with you, not at you.
Patrick, I think as we kind of wrap up this beautiful conversation, I think I would like to ask a very important question of you. If you were to insert yourself into the story through the eyes of Jane, and you too are had your wedding day ruined, saw the monster upstairs, heard the excuse from the man that you love, and he asks you to stay, would you stay or would you go?
I hope that I would have I hope that I would leave.
Aww.
Here's the thing. Here's the thing. I don't know if I would, especially in a world of holy shit, this guy's rich. I don't know. You can't be sure. But
just that security alone would keep you around to be like, well,
there's a chance.
I mean, he could maybe like keep having that lady, I guess, but I get to like have a nice fire and clothes and
think about the shopping spree we just went on. We just spent more money than I've ever seen in my life.
The shopping spree.
Patrick is, at the end of the day, a material girl.
I love it.
My dream is sugar baby.
And that's why he's marrying a future doctor, not marrying. You technically haven't proposed.
No spoilers. For life. For his real life, Lillian.
Real life is that I like his girlfriend and want them to get married. By the way, you said you were going to make Bex watch this. Did she watch it with you?
Yeah, she did. She was present.
What did she think?
Cool.
She was like, she reacted to like 3 things, and she was pretty sure Rochester was terrible. That was like 100% of her takeaway. As someone who half watched it, she was like, every time he did anything, she was like, this this motherfucker.
From what go ahead.
Bex would have stayed for sure, but Patrick would have. Oh no, she would have left for sure, and Patrick would have stayed for the money.
Oh, she would have left well before that. She would have left 2 months into being a governess and taken it out.
The very first time he like showed up and made her sit in the chair when she wanted to move it, Bex would have been out. Yeah. I know Bex well enough to know that she would have left.
Incredible. Oh my gosh. Patrick, thank you so much for bringing a new perspective into the studio, for watching a weird old movie that you maybe didn't care to see, but you did it anyway. Thank you for that, for sharing your thoughts and opinions.
Yes, of course.
We always do ratings at the end. It's a scale of 1 to 10, but you get to decide 1 to 10 of what. So examples of the past is Piper has rated it on Timmy D's. I've frequently rated on Pilot the Dogs. But I'm going to make you go first. So what would you, on a scale of 1 to 10, rate this movie?
I would rate it 8 out of 10 Orson Welles.
Okay. Peak Levy?
Awesome. I would also rate it 8 out of 10. And I'm going to use the metric of cupcakes, because that's what I think of when I see Adele's little dress.
I also am thinking Adele's dress. But I'm going to go with 9 out of 10 ballerinas. And also, here's a fun fact for our listeners. We swapped ratings. When we first watched this, Piper rated it 9 out of 10, and now I'm rating it 9 out of 10. And I rated it 8 out of 10 last time. So
was it all of the actual like quotes from the novel that kind of pushed you over?
The first time I watched it, I think some of the melodrama like turned me off. And I also was so angry about the way they started it with taking so much agency away from the female characters that I lost the like appreciation of Jane Eyre, where I think this time I was able to see how much care was put into telling the story of Jane Eyre, even with sexist assholes. So
there you go. Yay. And I couldn't help but swoon every time I saw Orson Welles, because he's like freakishly barrel-chested and tall compared to this lady, and like he's always like looming over her in a doorway, and I'm like, whoa, oh my goodness. It's crazy.
By the way, Orson Welles, someone who there was a lot of shots where they were clearly trying to make him seem taller. So I was having trouble telling, like, is Orson Welles actually a tall man? Or are they trying to make him, is he one of those actors who turns out to be really short? He's not really short, but he is really short relative to one of the people currently on this podcast, because this man was 6 feet tall. And so Patrick would have towered over him.
Yeah.
Lillian comes from a family of giants. Yeah. I'm like a little pea in a pod when I stand next to these guys.
My shorter of my brothers is 6 feet tall. Patrick is 6'6".
Yeah.
Yeah. Tall boy.
Dang. It's amazing you can fit in the studio.
Yeah, you guys, your square footage here isn't great.
Awesome.
It's a bit
Thank you.
Yeah.
So next week, Lillian, what do people have to look forward to if they tune in again?
Well, unfortunately, we have not harangued Patrick into coming back. But fortunately, we are revisiting a previous topic that we've done on this podcast before, which is fan fiction. And for those of you who have been listening since then and heard that episode, you know that Piper and I each wrote a Jane Eyre fan fiction that you can read on our website right now, airbuds.com. And we are going to be talking about those because we didn't have enough time to do it on the last one. So we are reading each other's fan fiction and we're going to chat about that.
Yeah. Going to like interview each other, kind of talk about like what was your direction, your inspiration. I feel like it's also really fitting because it is technically NaNoWriMo as well, National Novel Writing Month. So I've been in a wild writing frenzy myself. So I'm excited to go back to these and chat about them.
If people want to tell Patrick all of their distaste of his opinions, first of all, I get it. I'll give you his personal email. In order to get that, though, you do have to email us at airbuds@gmail.com. We get so many good emails there. We so appreciate all of those. We have had a few people who heard that we're sort of at a point where we're starting to wrap up the podcast, and you have made me cry, in case you were wondering. Mostly good tears, but it's so lovely to hear how much this podcast means to you guys. It means a lot to us too.
Yeah, it does. So thank you. Keep sending us nice words and join us on social at Airbuds. You can still get this out to more people before we do that final wrap up by leaving 5 stars on your podcast app of choice. We'd love to hit that little boost and get a few more people.
Yeah, rate your thoughts about Orson Welles' height. Do you think 6 feet is really respectable, or do you think that maybe he was sort of lying the way men do on dating apps?
Yeah, we'll have to see. But until then, you guys, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you again,
Thank
Patrick.
You, Patrick. And I know I mostly roasted you, but thank you.
We will see you next week. Until then, happy Jane Eyre reading and watching.
Bye.
Bye, guys.
Bye.